Lacey Peterson. On Christmas Eve, 2002, a pregnant woman disappeared from her home in Modesto, California. Lacey Peterson, 27 years old, was 8 months pregnant with a son she and her husband Scott had planned to name Connor. Scott Peterson reported his wife missing after he claimed to return from a fishing trip to Berkeley Marina. He told investigators he had last seen Lacey that morning when she was preparing to walk their dog. The disappearance of a pregnant woman during the holidays captured national attention. Search parties combed through Modesto neighborhoods. Volunteers posted flyers with Lacey's picture. Law enforcement interviewed neighbors and reviewed security footage from nearby businesses. Scott appeared on television pleading for his wife's safe return. To observers, he seemed like a distraught husband, desperate to find his missing wife. But investigators noticed inconsistencies in Scott's story. His account of the fishing trip raised questions. Why? Would someone go fishing in San Francisco Bay in winter? The weather had been poor, and Scott was not known as an avid fisherman. His decision to drive nearly 2 hours from Modesto to Berkeley for a last-minute solo fishing excursion seemed unusual. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Scott had been having an affair with a woman named Amber Frey. Amber came forward to police after learning about Lacey's disappearance. She told investigators that Scott had told her he was unmarried. When she discovered he had a missing pregnant wife, Amber agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. She allowed police to record her subsequent phone conversations with Scott. In those recorded conversations, Scott continued to lie to Amber, even as the search for Lacey intensified. He told Amber he was traveling in Europe when he was actually in California. He spoke about wanting to be with her in the future. The recordings revealed a man who seemed more concerned with maintaining his affair than with finding his missing wife. The motive became clear. Scott wanted to escape the responsibilities of marriage and impending fatherhood. In April 2003, bodies washed ashore in San Francisco Bay. First, a male infant was discovered. Days later, a woman's torso was found nearby. DNA testing confirmed these were Lacey and Connor Peterson. The remains were found near where Scott claimed he had been fishing on the day Lacey disappeared. This location was not random. Scott had told only a few people about his Berkeley Marina trip. The condition of the remains made determining exact cause of passing difficult. However, the bodies being found in the exact area Scott had mentioned fishing was damning evidence. Connor's body had separated from Lacey's, which was consistent with what would happen if a weighted body were disposed of in water. Medical examiners believed Lacey had been placed in the bay shortly after she disappeared. Police arrested Scott in April 2003. When officers apprehended him near the Mexican border, Scott had changed his appearance. He had dyed his hair blonde, grown a beard, and was carrying survival gear and approximately $15,000 in cash. His appearance and the items in his possession suggested he was fleeing the country. The trial began in June 2004 and lasted 5 months. The prosecution presented a mountain of circumstantial evidence against Scott. Amber Frey testified about the affair and played portions of the recorded phone calls. Forensic experts discussed the body's location and condition. Investigators detailed Scott's suspicious behavior after Lacey's disappearance. Hair samples matching Lacey's were found in pliers on Scott's boat. This evidence placed Lacey on the boat that Scott claimed he used alone for fishing. The defense argued the hair could have transferred to the boat innocently, but prosecutors contended it showed Lacey had been on that boat on her last day alive. Scott's behavior before and after Lacey's disappearance painted a picture of guilt. He had researched currents in San Francisco Bay weeks before her disappearance. He told Amber about losing his wife weeks before Lacey actually disappeared. He showed little emotion when interviewed by media. These actions suggested someone who had planned ahead and was going through the motions of being a concerned husband. In November 2004, The jury convicted Scott of first-degree homicide for Lassie and second-degree for Connor. The different verdicts reflected the jury's belief that Scott had specifically targeted Lacey, but that Connor's passing was a consequence rather than a separate and intentional act. In March 2005, Scott was sentenced to capital punishment. Lassie's mother, Sharon Rocha, addressed Scott at sentencing, saying, "You took it all away." Her statement captured the complete devastation Scott had inflicted. Not just taking Lacey's life, but also the grandson the family would never meet, the future that had been stolen from all of them. Scott's sentence was overturned in 2020 due to concerns about jury selection bias. The California Supreme Court found that potential jurors who opposed capital punishment had been improperly excluded. Scott was resentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in 2021. Scott has maintained his innocence throughout. In early 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project, an independent organization from the National Innocence Project, announced it would represent Scott Peterson to investigate claims of suppressed evidence and conduct new DNA testing on items found at a nearby burglary. His defense team argues that evidence was overlooked and that other explanations exist for what happened to Lacey. However, the conviction has been upheld through multiple reviews. The case was the primary catalyst for the Unborn Victims of Violence Act of 2004, which is often colloquially referred to as Lassie and Connor's Law, and recognizes a fetus in utero as a legal victim if they are injured or killed during the commission of a federal crime. From a husband's betrayal to a predator who had been freed by the system. Samantha Runyon. In Stanton, California, on July 15, 2002, a young person was playing outside an apartment complex. Samantha Runyon, 5 years old, was with a friend in the courtyard when a man approached them. The man claimed he needed help finding his lost dog. When Samantha went to help, he grabbed her and forced her into his vehicle. The friend who witnessed this ran to get help, but by the time adults responded, Samantha and the man were gone. Samantha's body was found the next day in Cleveland National Forest. She had been harmed and then strangled. Her body had been positioned in a way that suggested the perpetrator wanted her to be found. This staging indicated something beyond opportunistic actions. It suggested someone who wanted attention or to send a message. The friend who had been with Samantha provided a description of the man and his vehicle. Law enforcement created a composite sketch based on this description. The sketch was distributed to media outlets and posted throughout Orange County. Someone who saw the sketch thought it resembled a man they knew, Alejandro Avila. When investigators looked into Avila's background, they discovered something disturbing. Avila had been tried in 2000 for incidents involving 2 young people. The trial had resulted in acquittal due to insufficient evidence. The jury in that case had not been convinced beyond reasonable doubt, and Avila had walked free. Now, 2 years later, another young person was deceased. Could Samantha's case have been prevented? DNA evidence collected from Samantha's body matched Avila. The forensic connection was definitive. Additionally, DNA found in Avila's vehicle matched Samantha. The evidence placed Samantha in Avila's car and established physical contact between them. Combined with the eyewitness identification and the circumstances of her abduction, the case against Avila was strong. Avila was arrested and charged. During investigation, details emerged about his history and patterns of behavior. Prosecutors described Avila as a predator who sought opportunities to target vulnerable individuals. His prior accusations, though not resulting in conviction, showed a pattern that law enforcement now connected to Samantha's case. The trial began in 2005. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the eyewitness testimony from Samantha's friend, and expert analysis of Avila's behavior patterns. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that the prior accusations should not influence the jury. However, the DNA was not circumstantial. It was direct physical evidence linking Avila to Samantha. The jury also heard about how Avila had approached the situation. The use of the lost dog story was a classic predatory tactic. Predators who target young people often use deceptive stories to gain trust and cooperation. The calculated nature of this approach showed planning rather than impulse. Avila was convicted of abduction, assault, and homicide. The jury found him guilty on all counts. At sentencing, Samantha's mother, Erin Runyon, addressed Avila, saying, "You took it all away." Her statement echoed what Sharon Rocha had said in Scott Peterson's case. The complete loss that comes when someone takes a loved one's life. Avila was sentenced to capital punishment in July 2005. The sentence reflected both the severity of what he had done and the vulnerability of his victim. California's moratorium on executions means Avila remains on death row rather than facing execution. But he will never be released. The case highlighted failures in how the system handles accusations against potential predators. Avila had been tried and acquitted 2 years before Samantha's case. The evidence in that earlier trial had not been sufficient for conviction, but it had been serious enough to warrant charges. Whether a different outcome in that trial could have prevented what happened to Samantha became a painful question for everyone involved. Samantha's passing led to the creation of the Joyful Child Foundation. Erin Runyon founded the organization to promote awareness and prevention programs. The foundation works to educate parents, young people, and communities about safety and how to recognize warning signs. Erin transformed her grief into action, intended to protect others from experiencing similar loss. The foundation's name, Joyful Child, reflected who Samantha had been. Those who knew her described a happy, energetic young person who loved playing outside and spending time with friends. The man who took her life stole not just her years, but also the joy she brought to those around her. From a predator who had been through the system to young people who took a life motivated by jealousy. Justine Vanderscoot. In Placer County, California, on Labor Day weekend 2003, a 17-year-old went on a date with her boyfriend. Justine Vanderscoot had been dating Daniel Bezimer. On September 1st, she went to meet Daniel at the home he shared with his roommate Brandon Fernandez. She never returned home. When her family could not reach her, they reported her missing. Daniel and Brandon initially denied knowing anything about Justine's whereabouts. They told police they had not seen her that day, but investigators noted inconsistencies in their accounts. The stories the two men told did not align with each other or with evidence of Justine's last known movements. Cell phone records and witness statements placed Justine at their residence on the day she disappeared. As pressure from investigators increased, Daniel and Brandon's denials began to crack. After weeks of investigation, both men confessed to what they had done. The confession revealed something more horrific than investigators had anticipated. Justine had not simply been taken from them quickly. Her final moments had been prolonged and terrifying. Daniel had strangled Justine inside the home. The reason? Jealousy. Daniel had learned that Justine was interested in another young man. Rather than accepting that their relationship might be ending, Daniel decided to ensure Justine would not be with anyone else. Brandon participated in restraining Justine and in what came next. After strangling Justine, they transported her body to a location near Applegate and buried her. They believed they had successfully concealed what they had done, but the most horrifying detail emerged during autopsy. Medical examiners found dirt in Justine's lungs. This physical evidence proved something unthinkable. Justine had still been alive when they buried her. The strangling had not ended her life immediately. She had been unconscious or unable to resist, but her body was still functioning. When Daniel and Brandon placed her in the ground and covered her with dirt, she had inhaled that dirt. She had suffocated while buried, aware or semi-aware of what was happening to her. The terror of those final moments was unimaginable. Daniel and Brandon led police to Justine's body following their confessions. The recovery of her remains allowed her family to finally know what had happened, though the knowledge brought more pain than closure. The autopsy findings meant they had to live with the understanding of how Justine had suffered. Both men pleaded guilty rather than going to trial. Daniel Bessemer pleaded guilty to first-degree charges and received 25 years to life in prison. Brandon Fernandez pleaded guilty to second-degree charges, reflecting his role as an accomplice rather than the primary perpetrator, and received 15 years to life. Justine's father, Don Vanderscoot, attended the sentencing hearing. He told the court that while nothing could bring Justine back, seeing both men held accountable provided a piece of justice. His statement reflected the reality that families of victims face. Justice through the legal system cannot undo what happened, but it can provide acknowledgement that what was done was wrong and that consequences follow. Daniel Bessemer was denied parole for the second time in February 2024. His next eligibility for a parole suitability hearing is currently scheduled for 2027. Each time he comes up for parole consideration, the board must weigh whether he has been rehabilitated against the severity of what he did to Justine. The fact that she was buried alive, that she suffered that particular horror, makes his release difficult to justify. Brandon Fernandez will also eventually face parole hearings. His shorter minimum sentence reflects that he was not the one who decided to take Justine's life. However, his participation in restraining her and in the burial makes him culpable. Whether he will ever be released depends on future parole board evaluations. The case illustrated how jealousy between young people can escalate to unthinkable actions. Daniel was 17 when he took Justine's life. Brandon was similarly young. Their ages raised questions about brain development, impulse control, and whether teenagers should face the same consequences as adults. But the brutality of what they did, particularly the burial while Justine was alive, made it difficult to argue for leniency based on age alone. From young people driven by jealousy to a case involving a couple seeking their dream retirement. Thomas and Jackie Hawks. In Newport Beach, California, in November 2004, a retired couple decided to sell their yacht. Thomas Hawks, 57, and Jackie Hawks, 47, had spent years working toward retirement on their boat, which they had named Well Deserved. They planned to sell the yacht and move to Arizona to be closer to their grandchildren. The boat represented years of savings and dreams, but family had become more important. The Hawks advertised the yacht for sale. Multiple potential buyers expressed interest. One of those interested buyers was Skylar DeLeon, who presented himself as someone with the financial means to purchase the vessel. Skylar arranged to take a sea trial of the boat, which is standard practice when purchasing a yacht. On November 15th, Thomas and Jackie took Skylar and his wife Jennifer out on the boat to demonstrate its features and capabilities. Thomas and Jackie never returned from that sea trial. When family members could not reach them, concern grew quickly. The Hawks were responsible people who maintained regular contact. Their sudden disappearance was completely out of character. Police investigated and discovered that the yacht was missing, along with Thomas and Jackie. The investigation quickly focused on Skylar DeLeon. Authorities learned that documents had been signed transferring ownership of the yacht to Skylar. However, the circumstances of these signatures raised immediate red flags. Financial records showed no payment had been made for the boat. The transfer appeared to have been coerced or forged. Investigators also discovered Skylar had not been alone during the sea trial. Besides his wife Jennifer, two other men, Alonzo Machane and John Kennedy, had been on board. As police pressured the accomplices, Alonzo Machane broke down and confessed to what had happened on that boat. According to Machane's testimony, the plan had been to steal the yacht and the Hawks' money from the beginning. Once the boat was far from shore, Skylar and the others overpowered Thomas and Jackie. They bound the couple and forced them to provide access to financial accounts and to sign paperwork transferring the boat's ownership. Then came the most brutal part. With Thomas and Jackie bound and unable to resist, the attackers tied the couple to the yacht's anchor. They threw Thomas and Jackie overboard while they were still alive. The anchor dragged the couple down into the ocean depths. They drowned while fully conscious of what was happening to them. The premeditation and cruelty of this method was staggering. Thomas and Jackie had spent their final moments underwater, bound to an anchor, drowning together. They had done nothing wrong except try to sell a boat they had worked their entire lives to afford. They had trusted potential buyers to be legitimate. Instead, they encountered people willing to commit unthinkable acts for financial gain. All 4 participants were arrested and charged. The trials focused on establishing who had planned the attack and who had participated in the actual drowning. Alonzo Machine's confession provided the detailed account prosecutors needed to build their cases. Skylar DeLeon was convicted and sentenced to capital punishment in 2009. Jennifer DeLeon received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The other accomplices received lesser sentences in exchange for their cooperation and testimony against Skylar. At sentencing, Jackie's son Ryan Hawks addressed Skylar directly, saying, "As you murdered my parents for financial gain." Ryan's statement captured the calculated nature of the crime. This was not a spontaneous act of passion or a situation that escalated unexpectedly. Skylar had planned to steal the yacht from the moment he contacted the Hawks about purchasing it. After conviction, details about Skylar's background emerged. Skylar had been a minor actor in Hollywood with small roles in television shows. The Hawks case was not Skylar's first serious offense. Previous criminal activity suggested a pattern of escalating behavior. The yacht theft and murders represented the most extreme point in that pattern. Years later, a controversy emerged regarding Skylar's transition and medical care while incarcerated. Skylar Preciosa DeLeon, who was convicted of the murders, underwent gender-affirming surgery in 2019 while in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Following a 2018 court ruling that recognized her right to gender-congruent medical care. Some argued this was appropriate medical treatment that the state was obligated to provide. Others, including the Hawks family, saw it as an injustice that someone who had committed such crimes received state-funded care while their victims received nothing. The controversy added another layer to an already complex case. Skylar remains on death row in California, where the moratorium on executions means the sentence will not be carried out. Thomas and Jackie Hawks' bodies were never recovered from the ocean depths where they drowned. From a yacht theft to an unsolved case involving Hollywood celebrity, Bonnie Lee Bakley. In Studio City, California, on May 4, 2001, a woman was shot while sitting in a vehicle outside a restaurant. Bonnie Lee Bakley, 44 years old, was waiting in the car while her husband Robert Blake went back inside the restaurant, claiming he had forgotten his handgun at their table. When Blake returned to the vehicle, he found Bonnie had been shot. She was transported to a hospital but did not survive her injuries. Robert Blake was a famous actor, known for his roles in classic films and television shows. His marriage to Bonnie had been unusual and troubled from the start. Bonnie had become pregnant, and DNA testing revealed Blake was the father. Blake married Bonnie, but he made it clear the marriage was about providing legitimacy for the offspring rather than love or commitment. The relationship was one of obligation rather than partnership. Bonnie had a history that raised questions about her character and activities. She had been involved in various schemes over the years, including mail-order operations that targeted lonely men. She had relationships with multiple celebrities and had used those connections to her advantage. Her pregnancy with Blake appeared to be part of a pattern of seeking out famous or wealthy men. When Bonnie was shot, investigators immediately looked at Blake as a potential suspect. The circumstances were suspicious. Blake leaving Bonnie alone in the car, the gun being forgotten at the restaurant, the convenient timing of the shooting. Blake had clear motive. He was trapped in a marriage he did not want. He had repeatedly expressed his unhappiness with the situation. Blake was arrested in April 2002 and charged with Bonnie's homicide. The prosecution's theory was that Blake had either shot Bonnie himself or had hired someone to do it. They presented evidence about Blake's statements regarding wanting to be free of the marriage. They showed that Blake had inquired about hiring someone to deal with the Bonnie problem before the shooting occurred. However, the physical evidence was problematic. No forensic evidence definitively placed Blake as the shooter. Gunpowder residue tests were inconclusive. No witnesses saw Blake with a weapon. The timeline Blake provided for his movements that night could not be completely disproven. The case relied heavily on motive and circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof. The trial began in 2004. Blake's defense team argued that Bonnie's history and activities had made her enemies. They suggested that someone from her past could have tracked her down and shot her for reasons unrelated to Blake. They pointed to Bonnie's various schemes and the men she had scammed over the years as potential suspects. In March 2005, the jury acquitted Blake of homicide charges. The jury also acquitted him of solicitation charges related to allegedly trying to hire someone to harm Bonnie. The acquittal shocked many observers who believed Blake was clearly guilty. However, the jury found that the prosecution had not proven its case beyond reasonable doubt. But the legal proceedings did not end with the criminal acquittal. Bonnie's family filed a civil wrongful ending lawsuit against Blake. Civil cases have a lower burden of proof than criminal cases. Instead of requiring proof beyond reasonable doubt, civil cases require only a preponderance of evidence. Essentially, that it is more likely than not that the defendant is responsible. In November 2005, a civil jury found Blake liable for Bonnie's passing. The jury ordered Blake to pay $30 million in damages. A California appeals court later cut the award in half to $15 million in 2008, though Blake filed for bankruptcy shortly thereafter. This amount was later reduced, but still represented a substantial financial judgment against Blake. The civil verdict meant that while Blake would never face criminals punishment, he was held legally responsible in civil court. Blake maintained his innocence throughout both trials, repeatedly stating, "I'm innocent." He argued that the criminal acquittal proved he had not been involved. He claimed the civil verdict was unjust and based on prejudice rather than evidence. Blake's supporters pointed to the acquittal as proof that reasonable doubt existed about his guilt. The case remains officially unsolved. No one has been arrested or charged other than Blake. And his acquittal means double jeopardy prevents him from being tried again for the same offense. Alternative theories suggest Bonnie's past activities created enemies who might have targeted her. Some investigators believed someone from her mail-order scheme operations or past relationships had found her and taken revenge. Robert Blake has since passed away, taking whatever knowledge he had about that night to his grave. The question of who shot Bonnie Lee Backley outside that restaurant remains unanswered. Was it Blake, desperate to escape an unwanted marriage? Was it someone from Bonnie's complicated past? Without additional evidence or confessions, the truth may never be definitively known. From an unsolved Hollywood case to a betrayal by someone who should have been protecting innocence. Sandra Cantu. In Tracy, California, in March 2009, a young person disappeared from a mobile home park. Sandra Cantu, 8 years old, lived in the Orchard Estates mobile home park with her family. On March 27th, Sandra was captured on security footage skipping and playing as she walked through the park. She appeared happy and carefree. Then she entered a residence and never emerged. When Sandra did not return home, her family immediately began searching. The mobile home park was a close-knit community where people knew each other. Sandra's disappearance sparked immediate concern and mobilized residents to help look for her. Police were called and organized official search efforts. Days passed with no sign of Sandra. On April 6th, irrigation workers discovered a suitcase in a pond. When authorities opened the suitcase, they found Sandra's body inside. Medical examiners determined she had been drugged, harmed, and strangled. The discovery of her body in such a condition, stuffed into luggage and discarded, shocked the community. Investigators reviewed the security footage from the mobile home park. The cameras showed Sandra entering a particular home. That home belonged to Melissa Huckabee. When police questioned Melissa about Sandra's visit, she initially denied any knowledge, but as investigation continued, her story changed. She admitted Sandra had been in her home, but claimed the young person had left afterward. Police obtained a search warrant for Melissa's home and vehicle. What they found was damning. The suitcase that contained Sandra's body was traced back to Melissa. It was her suitcase. Forensic evidence in her home and vehicle connected her to Sandra's passing. The evidence made it clear that Sandra had not left Melissa's home alive. Who was Melissa Huckabee? Melissa was a Sunday school teacher at a local church. She was someone parents trusted with their young people. She taught religious lessons and was seen as a pillar of the community. The revelation that someone in this position had taken a young person's life defied expectations. Female offenders who target young people are rare, and those in positions of trust who commit such acts are even rarer. Why would Melissa do this? Investigators and psychologists who examined the case suggested several possible motives. Some believed Melissa sought attention and was willing to create a tragedy to receive it. Others thought she had mental health issues that manifested in harmful ways. The true motive may never be fully understood because it requires understanding a psychology that most people find incomprehensible. Melissa Huckabee was arrested and charged. She faced multiple counts, including homicide, assault, and abduction. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence: the security footage, the suitcase, the forensic connections. Melissa's defense had limited options. In 2010, Melissa pleaded guilty to avoid trial. By entering a guilty plea, she accepted responsibility and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. During her plea, Melissa made a statement that Sandra did not suffer. This claim was disputed by forensic evidence, but may have been Melissa's attempt to minimize the horror of what she had done. The case prompted discussions about how communities can protect young people. Sandra had been taken by someone she likely knew and trusted. The mobile home park where Sandra lived implemented new security measures and safety protocols. Other communities examined their own systems for monitoring who has access to young people and how to identify warning signs. The fact that Melissa was female challenged common assumptions about who commits such offenses. Statistics show that the overwhelming majority of those who harm young people are male. Female offenders exist, but represent a small percentage. Melissa's case reminded people that danger can come from unexpected sources and that vigilance should not be limited by gender stereotypes. From a trusted teacher's betrayal to a case that began with glamour and ended with mutilation. Jasmine Fiore. In Buena Park, California, on August 15, 2009, a gruesome discovery was made in a dumpster behind an apartment complex. Someone had discarded a suitcase, and when authorities opened it, they found a woman's body inside. The body had been mutilated. Teeth and fingers had been removed, apparently to prevent identification. These deliberate actions suggested someone wanted to conceal the victim's identity. Despite the mutilation, investigators were able to identify the victim through an unexpected means. The woman had breast implants, and the serial numbers on those implants were traceable. Through this unusual method, authorities determined the victim was Jasmine Fiore, a 28-year-old model and aspiring actress. Jasmine had been reported missing by her husband just days earlier. That husband was Ryan Jenkins, a reality television personality. Ryan had appeared on a dating show and had recently married Jasmine. Their relationship had been tumultuous from the start, with friends and family describing arguments and concerns about the marriage. On the night Jasmine disappeared, witnesses reported seeing the couple arguing. Ryan had reported Jasmine missing, claiming she had simply not come home. His report initiated the missing person investigation that was ongoing when her body was discovered. Once Jasmine was identified through the implant serial numbers, investigators immediately focused on Ryan as the primary suspect. Medical examiners determined Jasmine had been strangled. The strangulation had been the cause of passing. The mutilation, the removal of teeth and fingers, had occurred after ending to prevent identification. This post-mortem mutilation showed planning and an attempt to evade detection. Ryan had not simply acted in a moment of rage. He had taken steps to conceal what he had done. Ryan fled to Canada before police could arrest him. He crossed the border into British Columbia. Authorities issued warrants for his arrest, but before they could execute the arrest, Ryan took his own life. Ryan Jenkins was found deceased on August 23, 2009, in a room at the Thunderbird Motel in Hope, British Columbia, where he had taken his own life following an international manhunt. The self-inflicted passing meant Ryan would never face trial. Investigators pieced together a likely scenario based on evidence. The couple's relationship had been marked by jealousy and control issues. Ryan appeared to have been possessive and volatile. On the night Jasmine disappeared, an argument had apparently escalated. Ryan strangled Jasmine, then faced the reality of what he had done. Rather than calling for help or turning himself in, he attempted to conceal her identity and dispose of her body. The timeline showed Ryan had waited approximately 24 hours after Jasmine's body was discovered before fleeing. During that time, he maintained the appearance of a concerned husband looking for his missing wife. He even participated in the missing person investigation, providing information to police while knowing exactly where Jasmine was and what had happened to her. The case highlighted issues about reality television and the vetting of participants. Ryan had a prior criminal history, including assault allegations. Questions arose about whether producers had adequately screened participants. For Jasmine's family, Ryan's passing before trial meant they would never hear him explain or take responsibility in court. There would be no trial testimony, no victim impact statements, no sentencing hearing where they could address him directly. The closure that comes from seeing justice carried out through the legal system was denied to them. The breast implant identification method that solved the case became part of forensic science discussions. While serial numbers on medical implants are not typically the first method of identification, they can be crucial when other methods are unavailable. Jasmine's case demonstrated the importance of maintaining databases of medical device serial numbers. The suitcase disposal method and the mutilation to prevent identification showed Ryan had some awareness of forensic investigation techniques. He knew that teeth and fingerprints were primary identification methods. His removal of these features was deliberate obstruction, but he had not considered the implant serial numbers or the forensic technologies that could identify Jasmine despite his efforts. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. From a reality television tragedy to a case that would take years to solve in the California desert. Pinyon Pines triple murder. In Pinyon Pines, California, in September 2006, 3 people were found deceased in a burned home. Becky Friedley, Vicky Friedley, and John Hayward had all been shot before the fire was set. The remote mountain community location made the crime scene particularly isolated. Investigators arrived to find the home had been deliberately torched, apparently to destroy evidence of what had occurred inside. Becky Friedley had been shot and her body placed in a wheelbarrow outside the home. This detail suggested the perpetrator had begun moving bodies, but either abandoned the effort or was interrupted. Inside the burned structure, investigators found Vicky Friedley and John Hayward. Both had been shot. The fire had been set after the shootings, an attempt to conceal the crime. The investigation faced immediate challenges. The remote location meant few witnesses. The fire had destroyed significant evidence. Investigators had to rely on forensic analysis and developing leads through background checks. Becky Friedley had a former boyfriend named Robert Pape. Their relationship had ended, and Becky had moved on, but Robert had not accepted the end gracefully. Friends reported Robert had shown signs of jealousy about Becky moving forward. Robert had a girlfriend named Kristen Smith. The two were in a relationship, yet Robert remained fixated on Becky. This emotional triangle created tension and resentment. Rather than accepting that Becky had the right to live her life as she chose, Robert apparently decided to take extreme action. Investigators analyzed phone records and cell tower data. During the time window when the shootings occurred, both Robert's and Kristen's phones were turned off. This coordinated shutdown of phones suggested both were involved and were attempting to avoid creating electronic evidence of their location. The phones being off during the precise window of the crimes was highly suspicious. A business card was found at the scene that linked Kristen Smith to the location. This physical evidence placed her at or near the crime scene. Combined with the cell phone data and the motive Robert had regarding Becky, investigators built a case against both Robert and Kristen. However, arrests did not come quickly. The case took years to develop. Robert Pape and Kristen Smith were first arrested in March 2014, 8 years after the crime. They were subsequently rearrested and formally charged in June 2016 after new evidence was presented to a grand jury. The delay reflected the challenges of building a case based largely on circumstantial evidence in a remote location with limited witnesses. When the case finally went to trial, the prosecution presented the cell phone data, the business card, witness testimony about Robert's jealousy, and forensic evidence from the scene. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that other explanations could exist for the phone shutoffs and the business card. However, the combination of evidence proved convincing to the jury. Both Robert Pape and Kristen Smith were convicted. The verdicts came after lengthy trials where every piece of evidence was scrutinized. The prosecution had to prove not just that Robert and Kristen were involved, but that they had acted together with intent to take 3 lives. The legal proceedings did not end with the initial convictions. Appeals and retrials extended the case for years. Defense attorneys argued various points of law and challenged aspects of how evidence had been presented. Each appeal and retrial meant the families of Becky, Vicky, and John had to relive the trauma and uncertainty. Robert Pape's conviction and life sentence were formally affirmed by the 4th District Court of Appeal in October 2022. As of 2026, he continues to serve his sentence at a California state prison. The case illustrated how jealousy over a former relationship can escalate to unthinkable violence. Robert could not accept that Becky had moved on. Rather than processing his feelings in healthy ways, he allowed resentment to build until it manifested in taking not just Becky's life, but also 2 others who happened to be present. Vicky Friedley and John Hayward were effectively bystanders who were eliminated because they were witnesses to what was being done to Becky. The remote Pinyon Pines location meant the crime scene was isolated. The perpetrators likely chose this setting specifically because they believed the isolation would give them time to complete their plan and potentially escape undetected. The fire set to destroy evidence showed planning and awareness of forensic investigation techniques. For the families of Becky, Vicky, and John, the decade-long legal proceedings meant years without closure. From the murders in 2006 to the final appeal affirmation in 2025, nearly 20 years passed. During that time, Robert and Kristen exhausted every possible legal avenue, while the families waited for finality. From a case that took years to solve to one that would shock the military community. Brittany Kilgore. In Fallbrook, California, in April 2012, a young woman was preparing to finalize her divorce and move on with her life. Brittany Kilgore, 22 years old, was married to a Marine who was deployed overseas. Their marriage had not worked out, and Brittany was in the process of leaving. On April 13th, Brittany accepted a dinner invitation from someone she knew through the military community. That person was Louis Perez, a Marine staff sergeant. Brittany thought she was going to a dinner with Louis and his wife. Instead, Louis brought Brittany to a location where 2 women, Dorothy Maraglino and Jessica Lopez, were waiting. What Brittany believed would be a casual social dinner was actually a trap. The 3 perpetrators subjected Brittany to torture over several hours. The details of what was done to her were so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to process the evidence. Brittany was ultimately strangled. Her body was found days later, discarded along a roadside in San Diego County. When Brittany failed to return home or respond to messages, friends reported her missing. The last person known to have seen her was Louis Perez, so investigators immediately interviewed him. Louis claimed he had dropped Brittany off at a location and that she had gone off with someone else. His story did not hold up under scrutiny. Cell phone records and other evidence contradicted his account. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered disturbing information about Louis, Dorothy, and Jessica. The three were involved in a lifestyle centered around certain practices that they took to dangerous extremes. What should have remained consensual had apparently escalated. Brittany was vulnerable, going through a divorce, new to the area, isolated from support. The perpetrators apparently viewed her as someone they could manipulate. Autopsy results showed Brittany had been subjected to a stun gun and that attempts had been made to dismember her body. The physical evidence documented the tortures she had endured. Jessica Lopez had written a note detailing what they had done to Brittany. This note provided investigators with a chilling account of the perpetrator's actions and mindset. All three were arrested and charged. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The note Jessica had written, the forensic evidence from Brittany's body, the cell phone records, and witness statements all pointed to their guilt. The prosecution built a case that showed premeditation and collaboration among all three perpetrators. The trials focused on establishing that this was not a situation that had gone wrong accidentally, but rather a planned attack. The perpetrators had discussed their intentions. They had prepared the location. They had deliberately targeted Brittany. This was not impulsive action, but calculated planning. All three defendants were convicted. Luis Perez, Dorothy Maraglino, and Jessica Lopez each received life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentences reflected both the brutality of what they had done and the premeditated nature of their actions. In 2026, appeals to overturn these life sentences were denied. The appellate court affirmed the convictions and sentences. All three will remain in prison for the rest of their lives. The case raised questions about how consensual adult activities can become gateways to harmful behavior when boundaries are not respected. The perpetrators claimed their lifestyle was normal and consensual, but what they did to Brittany was neither consensual nor acceptable. They crossed fundamental lines that separate legal activities between consenting adults from criminal assault and homicide. The military connection added another dimension to the case. Luis Perez was a staff sergeant, someone in a position of authority and trust. His abuse of that position to target Brittany reflected a betrayal not just of her, but of the trust the military community places in its leaders. The Marine Corps took steps to review how such situations could be prevented in the future. For Brittany's family, the knowledge of what she endured in her final hours was unbearable. She had simply accepted a dinner invitation from someone she thought was a friend. She had trusted Luis because of the military connection they shared. That trust cost Brittany her life. From a case involving torture to one where the official ruling would be disputed for years. Rebecca Zahau. In Coronado, California, in July 2011, a woman was found hanging from a balcony at a mansion. Rebecca Zahau, 32 years old, was the girlfriend of pharmaceutical executive Jonah Shackney. She was found bound hand and foot with a rope around her neck, hanging from a second-story balcony. The scene was immediately suspicious. How could someone bind their own hands and feet, then hang themselves? Law enforcement investigated and concluded Rebecca's passing was self-inflicted. According to their theory, Rebecca had been distraught over an incident involving Jonah's young son, who had been seriously injured while under her care. The official determination was that Rebecca, overwhelmed by guilt and grief, had taken her own life in an elaborate staged manner. But Rebecca's family did not accept this conclusion. They hired forensic experts who examined the evidence and raised significant questions about the official ruling. How could Rebecca have achieved the complex binding while alone? Why would someone choosing to end their own life go through such an elaborate process? What explained certain injuries on Rebecca's body that were inconsistent with the official narrative? The official autopsy conducted by the San Diego medical examiner specifically stated that Rebecca Zahau's hyoid bone was intact and showed no signs of fracture. a finding that the medical examiner used to support the ruling of death by hanging. The circumstances were complicated by another tragedy. 2 days before Rebecca was found, Jonah's son had fallen downstairs at the mansion. The official investigation suggested Rebecca blamed herself for this, and that guilt drove her actions. Jonah Shackney's brother, Adam Shackney, was the person who discovered Rebecca's body. He was staying at a guest house on the property. According to Adam's account, he heard something, investigated, and found Rebecca hanging from the balcony. He claimed he cut her down and attempted to revive her, but she was already deceased. Rebecca's family found Adam's involvement suspicious. They believed his presence at the scene and his discovery of the body warranted closer scrutiny than law enforcement had provided. The family filed a wrongful ending lawsuit in civil court against Adam Shackney. Civil cases have a lower burden of proof than criminal cases. The family did not need to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Adam was responsible. They needed only to show it was more likely than not that he had caused Rebecca's passing. The civil trial became an opportunity to present evidence and theories that had not been fully explored in the official investigation. In 2018, a civil jury found Adam Shackney liable for Rebecca's passing. The jury awarded Rebecca's family $5 million in damages. This verdict directly contradicted the official ruling that Rebecca's passing was self-inflicted. The civil jury had heard evidence and concluded that Adam bore responsibility for what happened to Rebecca. Adam Shackney appealed the verdict, and eventually a settlement was reached. The terms of the settlement were not publicly disclosed, but it ended the legal proceedings between Adam and Rebecca's family. The settlement did not change the official classification of Rebecca's passing as self-inflicted. In 2025, a book was released that included new information about the case. The book revealed witness statements about hearing someone say, "Hold her still," on the night Rebecca was found. This statement, if accurate, would indicate multiple people were present and that Rebecca was being restrained by force. Such evidence contradicts the self-inflicted ruling. Rebecca's family eventually dropped their efforts to have the official ruling changed. After years of legal battles and investigation, they concluded that further fighting would not bring Rebecca back or definitively prove what happened. The emotional and financial toll of continued litigation became too much to sustain. The case remains officially classified as self-inflicted, though significant questions persist. The civil jury's finding of liability against Adam Shackney stands in tension with the official ruling. These contradictory conclusions mean different legal systems reached opposite conclusions about the same set of facts. For those who believe the official ruling, Rebecca's passing was a tragedy compounded by the earlier incident involving the young person. For those who believe the civil jury, Rebecca was taken from this life by someone else, and the official investigation failed to properly identify what occurred. The truth may never be definitively established to everyone's satisfaction. From a disputed ruling to a case involving calculated deception and a theatrical alibi. Sam Hare and Julie Kibuishi. In Costa Mesa, California, in May 2010, a young woman was found deceased in an apartment. Julie Kibuishi, 23 years old, had been shot. The scene had been staged to look like she had been harmed before being shot. Her body was partially undressed, and the apartment showed signs of struggle. Investigators initially believed they were looking at a case involving assault and homicide. The apartment belonged to Sam Hare, a military veteran and aspiring actor. Sam was not at the apartment when Julie's body was found. Investigators searched for Sam, believing he might be a suspect in Julie's passing or might be in danger himself. Text messages from Sam's phone suggested he was alive and on the run. The messages indicated Sam knew about Julie's passing and was fleeing, but something seemed off about the case. The staged nature of the scene was unusually elaborate. The text messages from Sam's phone did not sound like him. Friends and family insisted Sam would never harm Julie or anyone else. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered the truth was far more calculated than the staged scene suggested. Sam Hare had been taken from this life days before Julie. His body had been shot and dismembered. Parts of Sam's body were found in a theater attic in Long Beach. The person who had done this was someone Sam knew and trusted, Daniel Wozniak, a fellow actor and friend. Daniel Wozniak needed money for his upcoming wedding. He was in financial distress and saw Sam as a solution. Sam had recently received a military stipend and had money in his accounts. Daniel decided to take Sam's life and steal his money. But Daniel knew that Sam's disappearance would raise questions, so he developed a plan to misdirect investigators. After ending Sam's life and dismembering the body, Daniel called Julie Kibuishi. He pretended to be helping Sam move some items and asked Julie to go to Sam's apartment. When Julie arrived, Daniel shot her. He then staged the scene to make it appear Sam had harmed Julie before fleeing. Daniel sent text messages from Sam's phone to create the impression Sam was on the run. The plan was elaborate, but it had flaws. Daniel had used Sam's ATM card to withdraw money after Sam was deceased. Security camera footage from ATMs showed someone using Sam's card. That someone was identified as Daniel. This financial trail led investigators directly to him. Another crucial mistake was Daniel's behavior in the days after the murders. Daniel had a leading role in a community theater production that was performing during the investigation. While police were actively searching for Sam and investigating Julie's passing, Daniel was on stage performing. His ability to act normally and perform while knowing what he had done struck investigators as especially cold. The theater connection provided investigators with a crucial lead. The dismembered parts of Sam's body had been hidden in a theater attic. Not the same theater where Daniel was performing, but one where he had access. Daniel had used his knowledge of theater spaces to conceal evidence. The choice of hiding location pointed investigators towards someone in the theater community. Daniel Wozniak was arrested and charged with both murders. The evidence against him was substantial. The ATM footage, the access to the theater where Sam's body was hidden, the cell phone records, and the staging of Julie's scene all pointed to Daniel's guilt. His motive was clear: financial desperation combined with cold calculation. Daniel's fiancée was also arrested initially. Prosecutors believed she had knowledge of what Daniel had done and possibly assisted him. However, the charges against her were eventually reduced as prosecutors determined her level of involvement was limited. She received a lesser sentence for being an accessory after the fact. Daniel Wozniak was convicted of both first-degree murders. The jury heard testimony about the elaborate planning, the brutal nature of what was done to Sam, and the cold decision to take Julie's life simply to frame Sam. The premeditation and multiple victims made Daniel eligible for capital punishment. Daniel was sentenced to execution. He remains on death row in California, where the state's moratorium on executions means he will not face execution, but will remain incarcerated for life. The California Supreme Court upheld Daniel Wozniak's death sentence in July 2024, ruling that the premeditated and gruesome nature of the double murder and dismemberment justified the original jury's verdict. For Sam Herr's family, the knowledge that he was targeted by someone he considered a friend was particularly painful. Sam had served his country in the military and was pursuing his dreams of acting. He had trusted Daniel, and that trust cost him his life. For Julie Kibuishi's family, the senseless nature of her passing was devastating. Julie had done nothing except respond to a friend's request for help. She went to Sam's apartment to assist with what she believed was a legitimate need. Instead, she walked into a trap and was eliminated to serve as part of Daniel's cover story. From theatrical deception to a family that vanished from their home. McStay family. In Fallbrook, California, in February 2010, a family of 4 disappeared from their home. Joseph McStay, his wife Summer, and their 2 young sons simply vanished. The house showed no signs of struggle or forced entry. Food was left on the counter. The family's dogs were in the backyard. Everything suggested the family had left suddenly and voluntarily. Investigators initially treated the case as a missing persons investigation. They examined finances, interviewed associates, and checked border crossings. Security footage from the border showed what appeared to be the family crossing into Mexico. This led many to believe they had left voluntarily. Years passed with no sign of the McStays. The case grew cold. Then, in November 2013, a motorcyclist riding in the Mojave Desert discovered human remains. The location was remote, in the desert north of Victorville. Investigators uncovered 4 bodies buried in shallow graves. DNA testing confirmed these were Joseph, Summer, and their 2 sons. Medical examiners determined all 4 had been bludgeoned with a sledgehammer. The brutality of the method and the fact that young people had been targeted shocked investigators and the public. This was not a family that had left voluntarily. They had been taken from their home and executed in the desert. The investigation shifted from missing persons to homicide. Investigators re-examined evidence from the family's home and life. They looked at Joseph's business dealings and personal relationships. One person who kept appearing in the investigation was Charles Merritt, Joseph's business partner. Charles Merritt had been the last person known to have spoken with Joseph before the family disappeared. He claimed he had been helping Joseph with business matters and had no knowledge of what happened to the family. For years, Charles maintained this story and even participated in media interviews about the missing McStays. But investigators found evidence that contradicted Charles's claims. Financial records showed Charles had access to Joseph's business accounts and had been writing checks to himself after the family disappeared. Cell tower data placed Charles's phone near the desert burial location around the time the bodies would have been disposed of. The financial motive and the physical evidence pointed to Charles. Charles Merritt was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree homicide. The prosecution's theory was that Charles had taken the family's lives for financial gain. Joseph had been successful in his business, and Charles apparently wanted to take control of those assets. The only way to do that was to eliminate Joseph and his family. The trial focused on the circumstantial evidence connecting Charles to the crimes. There were no witnesses to the actual acts. No forensic evidence definitively placed Charles at the scene. But the totality of the evidence, the financial motive, the cell phone data, Charles being the last person to see Joseph alive, and his suspicious behavior after the disappearance, built a compelling case. Charles Merritt was convicted on all 4 counts in 2019. He was sentenced to execution for the murders. The jury found that Charles had acted with premeditation and that the murders were especially heinous due to the involvement of young people. In 2025, a book was published that raised questions about the cell phone data used to convict Charles. The author argued that the tower data was not as definitive as prosecutors had claimed. This scrutiny led to renewed debate about the strength of the evidence against Charles. However, appeals of his conviction have been unsuccessful to date. Charles maintains his innocence. His defense team argues that the evidence was circumstantial and that other explanations exist for the financial transactions and phone data. They contend that the real perpetrators were never identified and that Charles was convicted because investigators needed to solve a high-profile case. For the families of Joseph, Summer, and the 2 young people, the trial and conviction provided some closure. But the knowledge of what happened, that the entire family was executed in the desert and buried in shallow graves, remains unbearable. The young people particularly haunt the memory of this case, as they were simply victims of circumstance, targeted because of their father's business relationship. The initial theory that the family had voluntarily crossed into Mexico was proven completely wrong by the discovery of the bodies. Following the discovery of the family's remains in the Mojave Desert in November 2013, the FE and San Diego County Sheriff's Department concluded that the family seen on the San Ysidro border surveillance footage was not the McStays, confirming they never left the United States alive. From a family eliminated for financial gain to a case involving a predator who had been paroled despite red flags. Chelsea King. In Rancho Bernardo, California, in February 2010, a 17-year-old went for a run in a community park. Chelsea King was a high school senior, an athlete, and a dedicated student. She went to Rancho Bernardo Community Park in the late afternoon to run on the trails. She never returned home. Chelsea's parents reported her missing when she did not come home that evening. Her car was found in the park parking lot. Her belongings were still in the vehicle. Massive searches were organized, with hundreds of volunteers combing through the park and surrounding areas looking for any sign of Chelsea. 5 days later, Chelsea's body was found in a shallow grave near the lake in the park. She had been harmed and strangled. The discovery devastated her family and shocked the San Diego community. A young person who had simply gone for a run had been targeted by a predator. Investigators analyzed evidence from the scene. DNA was collected that would prove crucial to identifying the perpetrator. The DNA was run through databases, and a match was found. The person whose DNA was at the scene was John Albert Gardner, a registered offender who was on parole. John Gardner had a history of offenses against young people. He had been convicted in 2000 and served 5 years, released on parole in 2005. However, the system had failed to adequately supervise him. Gardner had violated parole multiple times, but the violations had not resulted in him being returned to prison. This failure of supervision allowed Gardner to continue targeting potential victims. When confronted with the DNA evidence linking him to Chelsea's case, Gardner confessed not only to taking Chelsea's life, but also to another case. In 2009, a 14-year-old named Amber Dubois had disappeared in Escondido. Her case had remained unsolved. Gardner led investigators to where he had buried Amber's remains in a remote area. The confession to both cases revealed Gardner as a serial predator. He had been targeting young people in the San Diego area for years. Amber and Chelsea were the victims investigators knew about, but questions remained about whether there were other victims who had not been found. Gardner pleaded guilty to both murders to avoid execution. He received 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The plea deal meant Gardner would never face trial, and the families would not have to endure the trauma of court proceedings. However, it also meant some details of what happened would never be fully revealed in public testimony. The case led to the passage of Chelsea's Light, legislation that strengthened monitoring of registered offenders and increased penalties for parole violations. The law was intended to prevent future failures, like those that allowed Gardner to remain free despite multiple red flags. For Chelsea King's parents, the knowledge that Gardner had been identified as dangerous years before yet was allowed to remain in the community was particularly painful. Their daughter had been taken because the system failed to adequately monitor someone with a documented history of harmful behavior toward young people. For Amber Dubois's family, Gardner's confession finally provided answers about what had happened to their daughter. They had spent a year not knowing where Amber was or what had occurred. The discovery of her remains allowed them to finally lay her to rest, though the circumstances of her passing brought no peace. Gardner remains incarcerated, serving his life sentences. There have been no significant updates to his case in recent years. He will die in prison, never eligible for parole or release. The 2 families he destroyed continue to advocate for stronger protections and better monitoring of those who pose risks to young people. From a predator's failure of supervision to a case that exposed catastrophic system failures in protecting the vulnerable. Gabriel Fernandez. In Palmdale, California, in May 2013, emergency responders were called to an apartment for a report of an injured person. When they arrived, they found Gabriel Fernandez, 8 years old, with injuries so severe that paramedics were shocked. Gabriel was unconscious and unresponsive. He was transported to a hospital where he was placed on life support. 2 days later, Gabriel was declared brain dead. Medical examinations revealed Gabriel had been subjected to sustained and severe harm. He had fractured ribs, a cracked skull, burns, and numerous bruises and wounds in various stages of healing. The injuries indicated prolonged mistreatment over an extended period. This was not a single incident, but rather months of escalating harm. Gabriel's mother, Pearl Fernandez, and her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre, were present in the apartment. When questioned, their explanations for Gabriel's injuries did not match the medical evidence. They claimed Gabriel had fallen or hurt himself, but the nature and extent of the injuries were inconsistent with accidental causes. As investigators examined Gabriel's living situation, a horrifying picture emerged. Gabriel had been subjected to systematic mistreatment for months. He had been confined in small spaces, deprived of food, and subjected to various forms of harm. Prosecutors established that Isauro Aguirre specifically targeted and tortured the 8-year-old boy due to homophobic beliefs, fueled by Aguirre's perception that Gabriel was gay. The case became even more disturbing when investigators discovered that multiple people had reported concerns about Gabriel to Child Protective Services. Teachers, family members, and others had contacted authorities about signs that Gabriel was being harmed. Social workers had visited the home multiple times. Each time, they had failed to remove Gabriel from the dangerous environment. At least 8 reports had been made to the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services about Gabriel. Despite these reports, and despite Gabriel showing clear signs of harm, he was never removed from Pearl and Isauro's care. The system that was supposed to protect him had catastrophically failed. Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were both charged with first-degree homicide with special circumstances. The special circumstances included torture, making both eligible for capital punishment. The prosecution presented medical evidence, testimony from witnesses who had seen Gabriel's condition, and records of the reports made to child services. Isauro Aguirre was convicted and sentenced to execution in 2018. Pearl Fernandez pleaded guilty and received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Her plea deal removed the possibility of execution, but ensured she would never be released. The case did not end with the criminal convictions. 4 social workers who had been assigned to Gabriel's case were charged with felony child endangerment and falsifying records. The prosecution argued that these workers had failed to properly investigate the reports about Gabriel and had lied in their documentation to cover up their failures. This was the first time in California that social workers had been criminally charged in connection with a case like this. The charges against the social workers were eventually dismissed by an appellate court. The court ruled that social workers could not be held criminally liable for decisions made in the course of their duties, even if those decisions proved to be wrong. This ruling was controversial, with many arguing that accountability was necessary when failures are this egregious. In 2026, Gabriel's uncle honored what would have been Gabriel's 21st birthday. The uncle had been one of the family members who tried to get custody of Gabriel and who reported concerns about his welfare. His efforts to protect Gabriel had been blocked by the system. The case sparked widespread reforms in California's Child Protective Services. Training was enhanced, protocols were revised. But for Gabriel, these changes came too late. Gabriel's story became the subject of a documentary series that brought national attention to failures in child protection systems. The series highlighted how warning signs were ignored, how bureaucracy prioritized procedure over safety, and how a young person's life could fall through the cracks despite multiple people trying to intervene. Pearl Fernandez remains incarcerated serving her life sentence. Isauro Aguirre remains on death row, though recent efforts to have him resentenced have been denied. Both will spend the rest of their lives in prison for what they did to Gabriel. For Gabriel's extended family members who tried to protect him, the guilt and grief remain overwhelming. They knew Gabriel was in danger. They reported it. They fought for custody. But the system sided with Pearl despite all the evidence that Gabriel was not safe. The failure to act on obvious warning signs cost Gabriel his life. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.